Hey y'all, so today I'm going to be talking about how I organize my bookshelves. I've always been super interested to see how other people organize their books, partially to get ideas on how to organize my own, and partially just because it's really interesting to see how other people think about their organization. But lately I've been really watching a ton of bookshelf organization videos, like the types where it's like 7 ways to organize your bookshelves. And I found that while in some ways my own bookshelf organization is represented in those, I seem to have a much more like intricate, like really detailed organization that I didn't see people really doing. So I kind of wanted to sit down and talk about how I personally organize my books. I'm not trying to say that I have like this like grand new way of organizing books. It just seems like every time I hear people talking about their organization, it's much more broad and general than how I do mine. I guess I just do it very detail oriented. I don't know, we'll talk about it. And honestly, in watching these videos and thinking about my own organization, I kind of realized that I have some patterns in my organization that I didn't realize that I was really doing consciously, some kind of like subconscious things that I did every time I reorganized my bookshelf. So one realization that I've had over the past year or so is that I tend to fluctuate between 2 different styles of organizing my bookshelves. And I don't really deviate from these 2, I just kind of go back and forth between them whenever it suits me or whenever I feel like I've stared at the same thing for too long and I just want to change. So I'm going to talk about each of these, and I actually recently reorganized, so I'm going to show you what both of them look like. Obviously, they've changed over the years as I've added and gotten rid of books, but these are generally the same 2 styles of organization that I go back and forth between. And to be perfectly honest, both of them are actually very similar, but the differences are what parts of the organization are prioritized, because I tend to have like different layers of organization that are more detailed as you go down, and depending on which one is like the highest level, it kind of determines where everything goes. And that sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. So let me just explain the first one to you. So the first of the organization methods is a pretty common one. It is TBR versus read. I separate them out. I have 3 bookcases. I have 2 behind me and 1 to this side. And typically when I do this, the one over on this side is my unread books, and these 2 back here are my read books. This is how I had my bookshelves organized from about September of 2017 through about a couple weeks ago. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut to a clip where I show you how that organization went. So here are my bookshelves as they are currently organized, split up between my TBR books and the books that I've read. Over here on this bookshelf are all the books that I have not read yet. This is my TBR shelf. Up here at the top is where I have my books that I'm reading as part of my TBR shelf unhaul series. So these are the ones I have to read before April. Then I have a couple rows of series, and then a couple rows of standalones, which has gotten a little bit shuffled up lately because I have put like single books in a series that I need to catch up on down here, and then got subsequent books in the series, so they don't fit up here and they don't really match down here, so that's a little mixed up right now. And then as you can see, I then have 2 bookshelves full of books that I have read. Now, the thing with my bookshelf is I don't do a large sectional organization. I typically go shelf by shelf, which I always assume other people do, but then when I see organization videos, that's not what they do. So as you can see, I have a Harry Potter shelf, a Pendragon shelf, a Cassandra Clare shelf, and then a like mostly Brandon Sanderson shelf with a couple other series that I really love up there. And then I have like some YA series, and then I have my manga shelf. And then this shelf right here and the shelf next to it are full of standalones that I've read. This one is largely like young adult, although there are a couple adult ones on here. And this one is largely adult and nonfiction, but they're actually organized by genre. I have my contemporaries and fantasy and dystopian over here, and I have like mystery and nonfiction over here. So it just coincidentally happens that they're divided from young adult and adult. And then this bottom shelf down here on the left-hand side is my middle grade books. And then this last bookshelf on the right-hand bookcase is the one that's kind of the most mixed with stuff. It's a little bit of spillover because I've got some Harry Potter analysis books. I've got my graphic novels, or just my Scott Pilgrim series, and then I've got trade comics and all of my K-pop albums. So like all of that's kind of just mixed into the shelf. So a couple key details of this organization is that while I had one full shelf that was TBR and two full shelves that were read books, I still had like a fairly detailed organization within that, which of course, as you will have seen in that clip, is by genre. I almost always organize by genre, even if it's not like the overarching organization method, it still plays a part in my organization of my books. Which, despite the fact that genre can sometimes be a little ambiguous, it makes the most sense for me, especially as a librarian, because both of the major like library organization methods in the US are genre or subject based. One of those is the Dewey Decimal System, which you see mostly in public libraries and in like school libraries, like elementary school, high school, stuff like that. And that's very subject based, while the fiction is typically organized by like last name of author or by like genre within that. They usually use Dewey Decimal. And then academic libraries often use the Library of Congress system, which, while kind of split up differently than Dewey Decimal, is also based on subject or genre. Without explaining it too much and getting too detailed, Library of Congress also does have the author play into it in some form or fashion, but as a part of the very specific call number rather than just like organizing all the fiction books by author. Like, it is kind of organized by author last name, but within the very specific call number. That probably makes no sense to you if you've never worked in a library, but just trust me on this. Libraries that use Dewey Decimal will often have like it very explicitly organized by author in some sections, like the fiction section, whereas like Library of Congress often does have it organized by author in some form or fashion, but it's not quite as explicit. I'm gonna stop there because this doesn't really apply to what I'm talking about right now. I just started talking about library organization, which I guess is technically what we're talking about. I'm off topic. So anyway, genre, as vague as it can be sometimes, is often the easiest way for me to organize. So while I'll have it divided up by TBR and read, on my read shelves I will have a section devoted to Harry Potter, a Cassandra Clare, a Pendragon, manga, comics, stuff like that. They're still going to be separated out by genre. And the same goes for the shelf full of unread books. That will also be organized by genre, although on a smaller scale since I have less unread books. Another thing that you will have seen in that video is that my organization is largely on a shelf by shelf basis. I've seen a lot of organization videos where people will have an entire bookcase dedicated to a genre, and that's just simply not how I organize. Because while it is genre by genre, regardless, like I said, I'll have a Cassandra Clare shelf, I'll have a Pendragon shelf, I'll have a Harry Potter shelf. I have like single shelves devoted to certain things, and in some cases they spill over, but in that case I typically will have like 2 shelves across devoted to the same thing versus 2 shelves up and down, depending on how everything fits, because these 2 shelves behind me are actually different widths, and so that creates a whole different problem. So yeah, I don't know if it's maybe that I just don't own as many books as some of these people with full bookcases related to a certain genre, or maybe I just read a really huge selection of genres and therefore I have smaller genre sections. I'm not sure what it is. Either way, mine are mostly shelf by shelf organization, and while sometimes they do correlate across shelves, it's often side by side rather than up and down. Partially because, like I said, the bookshelves are different widths. I mean, right now I don't have it TBR versus unread behind me, but as you can see, manga, comics, visual novels are all across like one full shelf across 2 bookcases. So I think that's something that I do that I haven't really seen other people do when they talk about it. And the last thing that I realized, which will continue on to the second organization method, is actually one that I realized that I do subconsciously, and that is that I separate out series and standalones. standalones. And I guess I can't quite claim that I do this subconsciously because I do consciously separate out my series from my standalones, but I guess it's more that I've just never considered mixing them together, which I guess might sound odd from an outsider's perspective, but in my own mind, it's just kind of a given that the standalones and the series are not going to be in the same place even if they're from the same genre. And I didn't realize that that was kind of just like a given to me until I started reorganizing. And I will get more into this when I get into the second organizational method because I do think that it is a little bit more relevant to that one. But another thing I also do typically, but not all the time, is that I will often put like a single book in a series alongside the standalones. So like if I only have one book in a certain series, I will put it with standalones rather than with the series. Sometimes I mix that up depending on shelf space, but typically that's how I do it. So now we're gonna move on to this second form of organization, which typically I have called the genre-based organization, but I have realized in doing this that it's actually my standalones versus series organization. So let me go ahead and show you the clip of the bookshelves organized with standalones versus series. Okay, so tentatively, this is the new organization of these bookshelves. As you might be able to tell just from looking at it, over here I have all of my series, and over on this shelf I have all of my standalones. But how I have this organized right now is that this is my favorites shelf. This is the one that I'm currently reading, so I'm kind of just setting it here for now. And then this is a mix of a lot of different genres. Pretty much this is just the catch-all shelf, because down here is where I have my like mystery and my classics and my more literary fiction. And then down here is where I have my nonfiction on the left and my single books in series on the right. So any books where I don't have any other books in the series, that's where these are. And then like I said, my series are over here. I have my Harry Potter and my Brandon Sanderson still there. I have my Cassandra Clare over here, and some of my other favorite series on this shelf. The next shelf down, I put all of my dark manga over here, any other manga here, and my graphic novels and comics next to that. Then down here are a lot more series. I have them grouped mostly by genre, so I start over here with high fantasy, then some urban fantasy, then paranormal, and then dystopian and sci-fi. And then finally on the bottom, I still have my middle grade all grouped together, and then my adult high fantasy that I just fit down here next to, again, the K-pop albums. Also up here, I've left this empty because this is where I'm going to be putting my books for the TBR Shelf Unhaul series. I really wanted to keep a shelf open for those just so I can have a really visual way to see those really easily. So I will show you a clip of the bookshelves after I move those books here, because obviously that'll free up some spaces on the series bookshelves and on the standalone shelf. But overall, I really, really like the way that this looks, and especially the two series shelves. I really, really aesthetically like this. And I will like this a little bit more once I actually organize the standalone shelf a little bit better. But like I said, I really like the way that this overall looks. That said, something that I was very quick to notice is that there's not really much room to expand on any of these shelves with this organization, because I have that shelf up there that's empty, and therefore these other shelves are pretty crammed full of stuff. And the only real places where I even was able to put trinkets are on this shelf, that one, and down there. So like, it's pretty full, and there's not much room to expand. There are places where I've given myself room to expand. For example, I know I'm going to be buying the next of the illustrated editions, so obviously that's going to be going up there, and I've got room for that. But other than that, there's really room for some more manga. Maybe I can move the K-pop albums somewhere else and free up that space, but
Other than a few standalones, there's not really much room to move anything around here. It's all pretty jam-packed, which I guess is fine for the moment since my goal currently is to not buy very many more books because I am trying to get my TBR down. But at the same time, I am worried that if I were to buy more books, I just wouldn't be able to fit them anywhere. So while this looks really pretty, I'm a little bit concerned about expansion with this. Okay, so I moved over the books for my TBR shelf unhaul series onto this top shelf, and I've organized the standalones a little bit more. So this, as of right now, is, I believe, how it's going to look most of the time until these books from this shelf go back to their original places. It has left some gaps. As you can see, there's a gap down there. I've been able to fit some more of my trinkets onto the shelves, but in general, it still looks very organized and all of the series look really good together. This has opened up a little bit more room on these series shelves, but I don't think that that's gonna last because I do think that there are more books over here on this top shelf right now than there will be in further videos in that series, so I may have to reorganize the shelves in a few months once this section of the series is done. But for right now, I really like the way that this looks. I really especially like these two shelves. And I do, in general, really like this one as well, even though it doesn't look quite as uniform as these two do.
So as you'll see in that clip, aesthetically, this is definitely the organizational method that I prefer to look at. And I think that this really gets to the root as to why I separate out standalones and series almost subconsciously. It's the fact that series just look so good next to each other on the shelves that I don't even consider the thought of breaking up that continuity with standalones. But anyway, as you will have seen in that clip, my standalones are all along this bookcase, and behind me are the two shelves of series. Another thing that I think is kind of common across both of my organizational methods is bookshelf space. I really have to take into account like what bookshelf space I have, and I think that that dictates a good amount of where certain ambiguous books end up. Because currently as it stands, I have a little bit of extra room on my bookshelves, but with my K-pop albums down at the bottom and with certain trinkets on here, I kind of have them completely full. So I have to really maximize my space, and in some instances, I have to move some things around where I don't necessarily want to put them. For example, you might have noticed that on my standalone shelf, I have a couple series actually, where the series are like not continuous, whereas you can like read them in any order that you want. So for example, the Poirot series by Agatha Christie, that one, each book is very much kind of its own standalone. So I've actually put that one on the standalone shelf just because that's kind of how the books function. Ideally, I would put that on the series shelf because they do have a pretty continuous look to them, but I have to functionally put them on that shelf just because I don't have room on my series shelf, and also I don't really have a spot for them genre-wise that really they fit into. And additionally, I also have some other Agatha Christie books, mostly just different versions of And Then There Were None, and I kind of like having them all grouped in about the same place. So I guess in some ways I also organize by author, as you can see from my Cassandra Clare shelf and my Harry Potter shelf and my Brandon Sanderson shelf, and I guess my Pendragon shelf, but that one has multiple series on there now. So as I said in the clip, my standalones are also organized by genre. I have this time made a shelf of my favorite standalones. That's a new thing that I added in this time. I kind of just wanted to toy around with it and see if I liked it. But apart from the TBR shelf unhaul series books and that shelf of favorite standalones, the other three standalone shelves are all organized by genre. That said, on the standalone shelf, I do try my hardest to group authors together as well. So I guess on the standalone shelf, the overall organization is standalones, then genre, and then author. Whereas I guess on the series shelf, it's more like series and then author and then genre. Because as I mentioned, I have shelves devoted to like the Harry Potter series and then Cassandra Clare's books and Brandon Sanderson's books. But then apart from those, I kind of have all of the series that don't fit into that. So because of that, this shelf, which has mostly Pendragon but also a couple other series, and then this shelf and this shelf are all the series that don't fall into Harry Potter, Brandon Sanderson, and Cassandra Clare. And then of course, as I already mentioned, the manga, the graphic novels, the comics. Another way that I typically like to group my books, but doesn't always work out space-wise, is by age designation, so adult versus young adult versus middle grade. I tried to do that with this shelf right here and this one right here, and it didn't work out super well just because of the way that I had the space lined up. I couldn't really fit it so that I had genre distinctions in adult and genre distinctions in YA, but I do have a shelf down here, which you will have seen, that is all middle grade, and a shelf down here, which you will have seen, that is all of my adult high fantasy series. So I guess that's kind of another designation underneath that, is series, author, genre, age range. So I typically like to separate out the age range, but it's not quite as important as keeping genres together. Another thing that is sometimes a consideration but wasn't quite so much when reorganizing this time is that I like to have books that I like in frame when filming. I do really like having the Death Note series right here. Not gonna lie, I try to put it in frame regardless just because I love the look of all the black books next to each other. But that was more of a specific organization, like the last time that I had my books separated between standalones and series, so like my last bookshelf tour. But for this one, I was not going for that quite as much, although it was definitely like in the back of my mind. So I think that's about it for like my organization for each of them. I think that there are definitely some overarching themes that I see in both, but it just depends on which functionality I really want more at the time. Like sometimes I want to be able to see all my TBR books in one place, and aesthetically it's not my favorite just because I like seeing series all next to each other, all beautiful and all together. But it is a little bit more functional sometimes just because I can just scan all my TBR books and be like, ooh, I haven't read this one, I want to read it. So regardless of whether I'm going TBR versus read or standalones versus series, things that are common across it is typically I organize by genre, sometimes getting a little bit specific. On this shelf right here, and again this one, it goes from high fantasy to like urban fantasy to paranormal to sci-fi, so I regardless try to keep it genre based either way I organize. Another that sticks throughout all of it is I try to keep authors together. There are some instances where I don't keep them together, like my Liveberry books somehow never end up on the same shelf. I tend to split up the Diviner series and the Jim and Doyle trilogy, even though I kind of don't want to. But other than that, typically my authors do stay together. Cassandra Clare, Brandon Sanderson, Harry Potter stuff like that. And then of course, like I said, either way, I typically try to separate out my standalones versus my series, even if it's not the main overarching organization method. And like I said, in some ways that's functional because I think about them as very separate, but it's also aesthetically more pleasing because I have bookshelves full of full matching series, which just looks great. So I think that's about it. Honestly, the longer I talk about this, the more I realize that I am super detailed with how I organize my books, and I'm not sure if everyone else is just this detailed and doesn't really go into all that detail when talking about the organization, or if I'm just the weirdo librarian who wants every single book to be in its exact perfect spot. But that's how I organize. What can I say? I like having my authors together, and I like having my genres together, and I like having my standalones separate, which was something that I knew I did, but I didn't really think about like why I did it and why it was such a given. So that was, I think, the most interesting thing that I've learned while working on this video, is that for some reason for me it's just a given that my standalones are going to be separate from my series. So that's it for this video. Let me know down in the comments how you organize your bookshelves. Also let me know if you're as like explicitly detailed as I am, because I feel like I'm a little bit of a weirdo out on an island of over detail. This book has to be in this exact spot. So let me know if you also are like this. As always, I will leave links down in the description to my blog, Twitter, and Goodreads. Please add me as a friend on Goodreads. I would love to be friends with all of you. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!